ça?
Entre les deux tours, là. C'est la même.
Ah oui?
I was only 9 when the planes hit the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan on September 11th, 2001. Frankly, I was way too young to have any emotion other than fear at that point in time. I was far too ignorant to have an inkling as to how big of a deal the events were on that day. And it wasn't until I visited Ground Zero in my mid-20s that I really recognized the impact that 9/11 had on humanity. And the fear I had as a 9-year-old boy turned to sadness and tears as I stared into gaping holes where the towers used to stand. The months and years to come after 9/11 were a strange time for me and others my age, I'm sure. The patriotism of our nation swelled and the politicians strategized our revenge. It was soon announced that Al-Qaeda and a guy named Osama bin Laden were responsible for what happened. And by December of 2001, U.S. forces destroyed the mountain fortress of Tora Bora, killing many of the Al-Qaeda and pushing bin Laden into hiding. But by early 2003, the politicians began to set their sights on a new enemy. We were told that there were weapons of mass destruction being developed or used, or something was dangerous going on in Iraq, and we immediately need to rush into Iraq to stop a 9/11 sequel from happening. Now, as an 11-year-old boy, less than 2 years after 9/11, I watched our military rain hellfire on a city 6,000 miles away, a city that looked like any other town I had seen in America. I remember feeling a slight sense of vengeance watching it as a 12-year-old, but I know rewatching this footage now makes me feel much like I did when I was standing at Ground Zero. I've talked in some of my previous content about the US Petro Dollar and its effect on supply and demand for the almighty USD. But it wasn't until I did a bit of research that I came across some interesting coincidences from the years leading up to 9/11 and Iraq's policy with the petrodollar. For those of you who aren't familiar with the petrodollar, let's take a trip back to the 1970s.
In the past 7 years, there's been an average of one international monetary crisis every year. Now, who gains from these crises? Not the working man, not the investor, not the real producers of wealth. The gainers are the international money speculators. Because they thrive on crises, they help to create them. In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Once the US dollar was no longer backed by gold, those pesky speculators continued to push the value down. So the Nixon administration, led by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, struck a deal with Saudi Arabia and eventually all of the oil-producing countries in the world to only accept US dollar in exchange for their oil exports. The petrodollar system also creates surpluses of US dollar reserves for oil-producing countries, which needs to be recycled. These surplus dollars are spent on domestic consumption, lent abroad to meet the balance of payments of developing nations, or invested in US dollar-denominated assets. This last point is the most beneficial for the US dollar because petrodollars make their way back to the United States. These recycled dollars are used to purchase US securities. And these aren't my words, this is from Investopedia. With a little more digging, I came across this article from November 1st, 2000, written by Charles Recknagel. The author talks about Iraq moving away from the petrodollar and instead insisting on an oil for food program, which would allow them to sell their oil for euros. With 5% of the world oil supply on the line, the UN granted this request. What is an oil for food program? I had to look it up. Introduced by Bill Clinton and established by the United Nations, the Oil for Food program was established to allow Iraq to sell oil on the world market in exchange for food, medicine, and other humanitarian needs for ordinary Iraqi citizens, without allowing Iraq to boost its military capabilities. There was, however, a large list of abuses and investigations to research that took place during the entire life of this program. The important thing is, Iraq was leaving the petrodollar behind. Further down in the article, Recknagel writes this amazing piece of journalism. With Iraq now set to begin oil transactions in euros as early as next week, President Saddam Hussein has clearly made up his mind that banning the dollar is worth flying in the face of financial logic. The euro reached record lows last week as it traded at 82 cents to the dollar, down 30% since its launch in January last year. Currency traders say they don't expect a rebound soon. I mean, read that sentence. Knowing what you know about the markets, if anything at all, how would trading 4 euros during record lows be flying in the face of financial logic? And as journalists tend to do, Recknagel was completely wrong. Although I don't blame him personally, I'm sure he's a fine journalist, but he couldn't have been more wrong. Saddam Hussein was about to begin compiling his war chest with an asset that was going to double in the next 8 years. And the Oil for Food program? Well, that lasted until the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. A bit further into this article, I came across another very interesting statement. One camp led by the US and Britain, blah 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 blah, wants to maintain strict trade sanctions on Iraq until Baghdad proves it has no more weapons of mass destruction. But wait a minute, I hadn't heard about weapons of mass destruction until 2003. So why were potential WMDs in Iraq being reported on in 2000? And with a bit more digging, I found quite possibly one of the most ridiculous news articles I've ever read. From the Baltimore Sun, October 1st, 2002. In the 1980s, the CDC and a biological sample company, American Type Culture Collection, sent strains of all the germs Iraq used to make weapons, including anthrax, the bacteria that would make the botulism toxin, and the germ that causes gas gangrene, the records show. Iraq also got samples of other deadly pathogens, including West Nile virus. Are you scratching your head? America was the one that sent these pathogens in the 80s. So from the same article, they quoted this guy, "I don't think it would be accurate to say the United States government deliberately provided seed stocks to the Iraqis' biological weapons programs," said Jonathan Tucker, a former UN biological weapons inspector. But they did deliver samples that Iraq said had a legitimate public health purpose, which I think was naive to believe, even at the time. Anthrax and botulism. Now, I'm no doctor, but anthrax and botulism, those don't seem like they serve any legitimate health purpose. Moreover, if we've known about potential biological weapons of mass destruction in Iraq since the 1980s, why did we wait until 2003 to invade them because of it? Didn't we have enough bullshit going on in the Middle East at that point in time? At the end of the day, no one has the full story or knows all the reasons why we invaded Iraq in 2003. But can you imagine if Iraq had successfully divorced themselves from the petrodollar in 2000 and made double their return on their euro reserves? Would it perhaps have led to other oil-producing countries to leave the petrodollar as well? And as an American citizen, as someone who lives in the United States and trades in the US dollar, is that even something you would want to happen? If you like this video, please like, rate, subscribe, hit the bell, do anything, I don't know, just interact with the page. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, comments are welcome. And I guess I'll see you next time.